So I'm going to just put the set some context about flooding and why it's happening in the area. So I've done my background is working with spatial information. So there's a lot of data goes into this. We're blessed in this region to have some of the richest data sources in terms of historical photography and 3D models of anywhere in the state. So I'm going to try to take advantage of that. Principles of flood mitigation 101. We need to work with nature, not against it. So we need to understand where the water flows. It's pretty basic, really. And then we need to understand the cause of the flooding if we're going to come up with potential strategies to stop it. So let's look at Billinudgel. This is Billinudgel back in 1947. That's a pub. Everybody knows where that is. This is the creek. It flows, the floodwaters overtop this creek, flow down through underneath the railway bridge and down to join the creek further down, or stay in the creek. Overflows would come down this area to the south of the pub, flow through a big swamp, and then the water would go back into the creek here. Now, Spencer Jones is in the audience. He was headmaster at the school from 1958 to 85. It never flooded into the school during that period. Let's switch to the current day. Massive changes. We've got a whole development here. Remember, this was where the water used to go. We've now got an industrial estate built there. The water no longer has the opportunity of flowing through here, getting retained here and going out there. Next one, please. If we look at the terrain model, so this is a thing called LiDAR, which penetrates through vegetation to give a detailed terrain model. The darker blue colours are lower in the landscape, and you can see the channels here. What has to happen now is the water overflows through here like it used to, fills a much smaller swamp here, has to go through this little drain through the railway, along behind the building, up through the edge next to Sanctum, under the road, down beside the freeway to join here. This is what that drain looks like today. That's the main drainage for Billinudgel. So it's not rocket science to understand that Billinudgel needs to improve that drainage channel to reduce flooding. Next, please. If we then go to Ocean Shores, Ocean Shores is well up in the landscape. Now, I'm not going to profess to know what's causing the flooding in Ocean Shores. I don't know enough about the area. I'm interested in learning, right? But it too is largely influenced by the ability of water to escape where it's accumulating through drains. So it's another area where I'm sure if we do an investigation, we'll identify a whole bunch of pinch points where the water is being restricted, or where debris clogging up the drainage channels that are there and restricting flows to back it up and cause flooding. And the comment that there's a house which gets flooded every rain event is, I would guess, in this area, but yeah. Next one, please. Now, South Golden Beach, New Brighton. I live in New Brighton. I've looked at it for a long time and heard the stories. There's a lot of talk about outflows. There's a lot of talk about what's happened in drainage. To really understand what happens at New Brighton, South Golden Beach, you've got to go back to 1947 and look at the drainage flows there. So this is the creek that comes down and comes to New Brighton there. You can see a mass of drainage channels, all draining to the ocean there. What happens is when this creek, you'll see that it's convoluted. When this creek is in flood, the water breaks through the banks here. And in 1947, it would have flowed over land through there or there to join up with channels and then join up with water coming down from the north from Billinudgel Nature Reserve and out through an outfall there. Those red lines are the current roads. So the position of this outfall was right in Helen Street. So that's why, you know, the water is naturally trying to go to Helen Street. That's the pinch point, that's the basis of the flooding in this whole area. We go to the next one. 1958, the South Golden Beach development started. The first thing they did was close that outflow. So there's some really interesting conspiracy theories about what was going on in South Golden Beach at the time. One of them was that this was an airstrip. I've got no idea why people needed an airstrip in Northern Rivers that wasn't controlled by air traffic. But you can see that at this point, that channel is now closed. So that's the root cause of our problem, is that we no longer had that outflow which got rid of the excess floodwaters from 1958. A channel was constructed in the hope that the water could come out and back or direct that water over there. But next, over time in the next few years, so this is 62, we had the hotel developed there, more development down here, but there's not a lot of development. The quarry was started here where the Venice Day Church is, and the canal was developed further. We'll go through. More development in the 1966, so you can see a progressive development. Filling started to occur from this quarry. They weren't quarrying for the fun of it. It was to fill these areas, and the canal is starting to take more shape. Keep going. 71, again, more of the same. But probably the point in 1971, there's a lot of talk about the outflow. It didn't exist at that time in 1971, so it's not a natural feature. Now, unfortunately, there's a big gap in air photos at this point. And the next one's 1987, and you can see the outflow there, which was opened and had been closed in that time. But you can see that it's actually not connected at all to what was the major flow areas down here. This is where the creek was breaking its banks, and these were the outflows here. There are some remnant outflows there, but they were probably close with sand mining, and they were nowhere near as significant as the one that was at Helen Street. Next one. And in the 2000s, you know, we're pretty well there, except we've got a levee bank has been developed along here. So now the water that does come out here can't actually even flood South Golden Beach, although we all know that it did. So, but what it means is that water is going into this area here and building up in this area here. The other thing is, with the restrictions in drainage, restrictions in flow here, there's a lot of water coming down from the north, which is building up in this area here and is coming through the back of Fern Beach into South Golden Beach. So water's just trying to go where it used to be, basically, and we're trying to stop it. So we're already heavily down an engineering solution path now. Okay, next. All right, so looking at what can we do, or so yeah, this is again a terrain model underpinning the area. And you can see that water is most likely, if it's going to come into this area, once it gets to a certain level, is most likely coming through the back of the dunes there between Fern Beach and the dunes when it achieves a certain height. When it goes through there, it comes into Fern Beach. Now, one thing we've talked about, I cannot understand, what we're doing with those pumps is pumping water from here and putting it into here, which then goes up around here or around here. It doesn't make sense. So, you know, there's some basic strategies that we should be following. Next, please. Okay. Now this is the area, concentrating on the area between New Brighton and South Golden Beach. So we've got water coming through here, overtopping the canal, the channel, New Brighton, the Marshalls Creek Channel, and flowing into this area. It may have gone out here at some point, but it's not going out there, it's not going out there, and it can't get out over here. So what happens is it ponds up in this area, and when it gets to a certain height, 1.97 metres above AHD, it starts coming down here. And we have the flooding in New Brighton comes from the north. You'll see, if you go there after floods, you'll see that the debris is lined up, not coming out of the creek, but it's coming into the creek at this location. Now, you can imagine that if a channel up here can carry, if all the water that it can't carry is flowing out there, this channel is quite capable of carrying the amount of water that's left over in the creek channel after that water's all gone out. So if this was left by itself, there's every chance that New Brighton would not flood, because the channel here is about equivalent to up here, so it would probably work. However, when you add all this water back into it, we get flooded. And so I think we had damage to, was it over 100 houses in New Brighton? It's quite significant that, you know, it...
Is that our resident geologist, Molly?
Yeah.
You thought you could hide. You're busted. Rob, we're almost out of time.
Yep, okay. Finish. So if we're looking at reducing flood heights, I see that we've got three options. One is to pass it on downstream, and we do that by improving and maintaining drainage channels. That's the solutions that we can use up higher in the catchments. The second one is we can retain it safely and pass it on at a rate that doesn't impact downstream. So that's common where you have these detention ponds, where you basically hold the water back, store it, and then have leaky dams basically that then feed the water back into the system at a rate that the system can handle it. There's not a lot of options there. There are some, but you know, we can talk about that later. The other one is to take it off the floodplain, and I don't want to get into arguments about outflows versus channels versus pumps. So let's just say we're going to do that with magic sky pumps powered by rainbows, okay? That's the Northern Rivers solution. So there's been a history of hydrological modelling to look at different options. And, you know, so in the last model, previous models, they've looked at drainage. The last models, we got them to look at an outflow between South Golden Beach and New Brighton. As part of my day job, I run a research and development program which includes modelling. My job is about asking the right questions, and I think that's what we've got to do now, right? We've got to ask the questions of the modellers, because what's happened in the past is when they do a hydrological model, they'll model it with a certain outflow of a certain size and height, and then come back and say that didn't work. And they reject the whole option of getting rid of the water at that point because that particular run of the model didn't work. So where we've got to work towards is making sure that any simulations and modelling is aimed at answering the right questions, not at answering a question that the hydrologist has come up with. Yes, please. Okay, so the process I believe we've got to look at is we've got to try to understand what will happen under certain scenarios, under a certain strategy, what will happen to the flood flows, regardless of how we achieve that. So separate whether it's an outflow, whether it's a pump, whether it's an under-dune drainage system. Let's look at what happens if we take 10, 20, 50, 100 megalitres a minute out of a system at a specific location and see what happens to the flood level. If we then go on and look at what will certain levels of reduction in the flood levels have on the community. So how many houses will be saved if we reduce floods by 0.5 metre? How many, you know, what's the social impact, what's the cost? Thirdly, once we've identified appropriate solutions or strategies, we look at engineering options to discuss how we can achieve those outcomes. So, and at what cost. And once we've got costs for these, costs of damage, costs of achieving those reductions in flood heights, we can actually do a return on investment analysis and go to government saying, you know, if you spend, it doesn't matter if we've got to spend $20 million on flood pumps, for example, if it will save the community $100 million, then it's a good return on investment for government. So we've got to, I believe we've got to propose to the government with a business case of what they can save and somehow quantify social costs as well. So in terms of strategies, 3 areas that I know were called flooding are high up in the catchments. I think drainage and maintenance of channels and drainage control and possibly storage strategies will actually help in these areas. And then there's a bunch of areas here where getting water off the floodplain will actually achieve what we need to achieve. So, thank you. Intuitively, and I thought the same thing, intuitively, if you want to get more water out, you dredge a channel and make it bigger, right? The problem is that we are on a tidal creek. The baseline of the water, the amount of channel that we've got available to flow is not the base of the creek, it's actually low tide line. We can't get water flowing out below low tide. So if we were to increase our channel capacity where the bottom isn't exposed at low tide, we actually get nothing, no additional gain. Now rock walls are different because they actually extend up above high tide level, but you know, the dredging itself, and next one please. The dredging itself, now a lot of the creek has got areas of sandbank exposed at low tide, but when you actually look at how much that impacts upon flow, it's only in the, at low tide that we actually gain anything. And at high tide, we actually gain nothing. And the flood that happened in 2022 in February was actually at a 1.8 metre tide. It was probably had a storm surge, so we were probably looking at a sea level of well over 2 metres. And if you then take into account the amount of water that would have been coming down Brunswick River, we were probably looking at a base level of well over 2 metres, like 2 or 3 metres. And it's only the water, the amount of capacity above that level that will affect how fast the water will flow out. So we've got to be objective about the solutions that we push for, because
we have the rock walls, so that's explaining the dredging, but the rock wall in Readings Bay that goes from Christmas Beach, that side.
Again, that Readings Wall is covered at mid-tide, so I don't think Readings Wall will affect flood outflows. I'm not so sure about the main one on the channel, but when you look back at the photos, 47, 58 and that, the channel was, that area, Readings Bay was always sandy. It had channels going through it. They've shifted, but, I'm not sure it's going to be the panacea that we all think it should be. It could help, yeah.
Rob, can you say, hooked up to the mic? Let's throw to questions, and we're doing this in 1 minute sprints now. Who'd like to ask a question of Rob or Ziwar?
Yes, please. My question is about the climate.
Benji's bringing the microphone.
My question is about the climate. So there's so much energy in the atmosphere. Will our flood mitigation strategies actually stop the massive flooding that will occur from tropical low depressions that have that extra energy, so that our mitigation won't work because of the amount of rainfall that we are going to get in future years?
Climate change is real. Things are happening, but the patterning is more about things that we think are extreme now will happen more frequently. And so what we've just had is not going to be something that, you know, we hope we won't experience again in our lifetimes. It's probably going to be happening several times in our lifetime. And we've just got to shift our expectations to that. The climate, the latest flood modelling report actually included it was using scenarios with expected changes. And the expected changes are more intensive rainfall, higher sea levels, so we've got a higher base level. And yeah, but the strategies will still, we will have less severe floods as well. We'll still get a distribution, it will just be shifted and more frequent. So, you know, flood mitigation strategies will still work, but we've just got to be prepared to deal with the more extreme events.
I don't have a question just right now, but I'd like to thank you for the way you described this, because I think you've described how the natural flows used to happen and how we interfered with that with our development and how we changed the natural flows. And that's sometimes what's happening now. We're getting our flood effects by what we changed. I think it's a bit of a shame that we don't necessarily have all the councillors and potential people who might make a difference still in the room with us, because I think this is really important what you're pointing out, that we need to have these strategies based on what you're describing from a scientific perspective and what we could perhaps reverse from what we changed to make a difference in the future.
That's why we have Robyn Bolden.
Incidents anywhere else in Australia where we've reopened to the ocean? Are there communities where it's happened at all?
I don't know any, no.
I believe there's one in Manly. He knows. I was talking to someone recently.
Down that shop in the recent floods, and also Byron Bay
When I was a kid, so this is the 1980s in the Central Coast north of New South Wales, this would happen quite frequently, and the council brought the bulldozers out every time it rained and opened the ocean outfalls up to let them go so the houses didn't flood.
How do we make our council do it?
Yeah, I think we use this opportunity to put pressure on them to do exactly. Yeah.
Before he left, and he said the hydrologic modelling suggested, and I agree with one of your comments during your presentation. Thank you very much for that. It depends on how you ask the hydrologist what answer you'll get. Like briefing a lawyer, is what outcome you want. And I believe there's an amount of that because he can't get any funding unless he can prove it will take the water out. So unless we can prove it will take the water out, he can get no funding for it. That's his only answer. Right.
That's correct, and that's how it's listed in their reporting. And I
think we need to get the questions asked correctly about the flood events that we will be having, not on previous data.
Let's get the bulldozer down this week then.
That's not the way the process.
On the point, so there's not a lot of difference between the height between the swales and the high tide mark. Particularly if there's a storm surge coming, your high tide is probably going to be anything up to 2 or 3 metres higher than what it normally, even your high tide, happens. The problem with opening up an outfall, which hasn't got a strong freshwater component keeping the salt water out, is the potential for waves to come through and bring salt water into the environment. So we need to be cautious that we don't actually create a problem because we've got storm surges coming through the hole in the dunes, which we've and Dune Care has spent a lot of time creating in the first place to protect the houses. So we're concentrating on flooding here, but we are equally at threat from ocean storm surges and fire as well. But
hydraulic gate on a spillway, that's all you need.
I actually agree with that one, but that's why I'm trying to say that we need to, the steps we need to do is to establish that if we were to take out this much water from this point, we can reduce flooding. And once we get that tick, then we can start talking about engineering solutions that we can achieve that. Now, I know for at Cubby Station, for example, which is a big irrigator, when they turn on their pumps, they can reverse the flow of the Darling River. So when you talk about the capacity of flood pumps to be able to get rid of water, we're just talking about how big do you want, okay? So don't discount, but flood pumps have got a problem that they're unreliable if they put the wiring at the bottom of the tank and don't have power. So, but let's do this stepwise. Let's establish that we can find a solution by getting rid of the water, and then we can start discussing options. And I agree with you, an outlet under the dune.
Can I just say of a very simple method? As an ex-farmer with dams, and every dam had to have a spillway on it. So when there was a downpour, and they were all spring-fed dams, then the water would naturally go down around the spillway. Very simple, and reverse the situation with having a hydraulic gate on it so that when the ocean's coming in, you can close it off.
Yeah.
I think there's potential in that. Yes, I do agree.
We need to revisit what they've produced, and we need to scrutinise in detail and ask the right questions so that they don't get discounted overnight and not explored further. So we would love to hear from the community like yourself. The non-return valve needs to be considered. It's the first thing I said to Francesca when she said, can we do outlets? I said, if you pair it with a non-return valve, sure. But other than that, you're going to...
non-return valve is...
A hydraulic gate, something that stops the ocean coming in the times where...
So it lets the water out at low tide and then closes, doesn't let
and
the ocean
it's either on a smart system or manually controlled, lifted, raised.
Maybe I should do some drawings for you.
Exactly. You can do the drawings for us.
Okay. I think it's very clear that we need to ask the right questions of the consultants that have been appointed by council. And with that in mind, I'd like to nominate Rob Crossley to be our representative. We don't have a representative on the current flood committee, and I think he's a perfect person to represent us and ask the right questions. That's all I have to say. Thank you.